U.S. President Joe Biden has urged Israel to protect Palestinian civilians in its planned ground offensive of the Gazan city of Rafah. Biden met with Jordan's King Abdullah on Monday at the White House, their first face-to-face meeting since Israel's war with Hamas began. Biden said the two had discussed a possible 6-week break in the fighting. Jordan has been pushing for a permanent ceasefire. Washington is the king's first stop on a tour that includes Canada, France, and Germany. Here is part of what Biden had to say in a joint news conference, partly focused on Israel's expected move on Rafah.
The major military operation in Rafah should not proceed without a credible plan for ensuring the safety and support of more than 1 million people sheltering there.
Let's bring in our Jerusalem correspondent, Rebecca Ritters here. Rebecca, the U.S. is Israel's most important ally. It's one of several countries urging Israel to think twice about launching an assault on Rafah. How are these words of caution going down in Israel?
Well, Terry, this isn't the first time that the US president has said this. He reiterated comments that he made a few days ago. And it really depends when it comes to reaction on who you're talking to or who you're talking about. Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right coalition members don't take criticism against this operation very well. Many in the far right hit back against President Biden when he criticises their mission. When you're talking about the general populace within Israel, let's not forget that Israel's war in Gaza does have pretty strong broad spectrum support here in Israel. So when you talk to Israelis and you talk to them about criticism or international condemnation, most of them say, well, what do you expect? We have the right to defend ourselves. And that is really the main feeling across the country. Of course, there are some other voices who say that, that criticism from the international community, and particularly the US, need to be heeded. And I think in the end, that is something that will be taken seriously by Benjamin Netanyahu, even though publicly he might, he might condemn these comments or he might, hit back at the US president. But in the end, I think it's unlikely. He needs the US and he needs to try to avoid further international condemnation. So it is likely that any ground operation in Rafah will be taken, as he has said, that they will be looking to try to evacuate the civilians living there. And I think, it's unlikely that an operation will begin without at least some attempt to do that.
You say they might evacuate the civilian population. We're talking about over 1 million Palestinians who've been compressed into this town of Rafah. Where would they go, Rebecca? Does Israel have a plan to evacuate them to a particular place?
Well, that really is a major question being asked here, being asked by the international community in particular and by aid organisations, saying that there is just so few places left for people to be able to go. Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the Israeli military to come up with a plan. So far, nothing has been made publicly available as to where they see those Palestinians being able to go. There's very few options, as I mentioned. Much of the centre and the north of the Strip has been destroyed. There's few places that people could potentially go back to there, and they are literally running out of space in the southern part of the Strip. So it remains to be seen just what kind of plan the Israeli military will come up with. That is something that Benjamin Netanyahu has said is underway and is being looked at, but no details yet on that, Terry.
Meanwhile, talks are still going on, trying to broker a ceasefire and the release of those hostages being held by Hamas. How is the talk of assault on Rafah affecting those negotiations, Rebecca?
Well, quite severely, Terry. We've had, Hamas certainly saying that if there's a ground operation, then we are all out. We are not going to negotiate any longer. And we've had the likes of Egypt saying that if there's a ground operation without the evacuation of those civilians, that they are looking at potentially ripping up the peace agreement they have with Israel. Now, that would have huge ramifications in the region, not just within Israel, but a much wider ramification. So, some really strong words coming there, and of course affecting these negotiations. That is something that the Israeli population are looking at. They really, really want negotiations. They really want to see at least a limited ceasefire, or a majority certainly want to see a limited ceasefire in order to be able to have those remaining hostages returned safely. But these negotiations are ongoing despite threats of this ground operation. The Israeli military are sending a delegation to Egypt today. Egypt, Qatar playing a huge role. The US also playing a part in those negotiations. They continue. We saw some hope last week, people really sort of giving positive words coming out of those negotiations. We've seen that falter a little bit, but they continue. And the hope is, certainly from all sides, that all people involved in those negotiations, that some kind of deal could be met. If this ground operation goes ahead, however, that looks less and less likely.
Rebecca, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, in Jerusalem. Well, for more on this, let's cross over to journalist Karim El-Gawhary in Cairo. Karim, first of all, tell us what are Egypt's concerns concerning an Israeli ground invasion of Rafah. That's right on Egypt's border.
Yeah, right. And that's exactly why there is a big fear on the Egyptian side that there might be some kind of mass exodus from the Palestinian side towards Egypt, towards the north of Sinai. That would be, of course, not only a security problem for the Egyptians, but they really don't want to be seen as any kind of part in a wider displacement scenario of the Palestinians, because the big fear on the Egyptian side is not only that the people come over, but also that they might never be able to come back. There's also, like in the Egyptian media, talk that such ground offensive might reach the Camp David peace agreement, because within this agreement there is an agreement for a buffer zone between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, where the Israeli army, a demilitarized buffer zone, where the Israeli army can only be there without heavy weapons. So that's the other talk within the Egyptian media about this ground offensive.
Now, more than 1 million Palestinian civilians are believed to be sheltering in Rafah. They came there from other parts of the Gaza Strip seeking shelter. From what you know, Karim, where can they go if and when an invasion begins?
Well, yeah, no more South left in the Gaza Strip, obviously. So there is the choice of crossing over this mass exodus to Egypt. I think that what the Americans want from the Israelis, that they create some kind of corridor for people to flee towards the north. But, I mean, to flee where to? Big parts of the north are completely destroyed. There's nothing provided for the people, no food, no water, no medical attention, and they're standing in front of the ruins of their former life.
Karim, tell us about negotiations that are taking place right now in Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Israel, involving all of those. What would a ground offensive on Rafah mean for those negotiations?
Well, I think everyone is trying to put up the heat right now. I mean, alone the threat of the ground offensive is, of course, putting up the heat on Hamas from the Israeli side. And on the other side, Hamas is saying if there is this ground offensive, that will be the end about the negotiations about the return of hostages. So both sides are really trying to put up the heat here, but it's of course an extremely dangerous game.
The Biden administration is putting pressure on Israel to show some restraint. The Biden administration is also calling for at least a temporary ceasefire. How is that talk going down in Egypt and across the Palestinian territories?
Well, not really very well. I mean, when I saw the pictures now you showed when Biden was talking, I saw the King of Jordan besides him with quite a grim face while Biden was speaking. Of course, it was like, I heard both of them last night. It's like two words. Biden is not in principle against a ground offensive. He wants just the Israelis to manage this ground offensive in a certain way. The King of Jordan was very clear yesterday that he said there should be no ground offensive. There should be an immediate ceasefire. And then immediate talks about a political solution to this problem. So, I mean, we're talking like this was as if two worlds in one room yesterday with Biden and the King of Jordan.
Karim, thank you very much, as always. That was journalist Karim El-Gawhary in Cairo.
You're welcome.